At midnight, he stuffed her clothes into a trash bag and threw her out with their newborn. His mother stood in the doorway, smiling. His mistress watched from behind his shoulder, holding a glass of champagne. As rain soaked the baby blanket, he told her she'd never survive without him. What none of them knew was that every building they admired, every rent check they depended on, and the roof over their heads answered to the woman they had just cast into the street. Her name was Afra Bennett. She stood on the wet steps of the brownstone with her 3-week-old daughter pressed against her chest, and she did not scream. She did not beg. She only looked up at the man she had married, Salim, and waited to see if any part of the boy she once loved was still inside him. There was nothing left of that boy, only a hard, satisfied face lit by the porch light, and a mouth that had forgotten how to say her name with any kindness in it. The trash bag sat on the wet steps between them. He had filled it himself in a hurry with whatever his hands found first. A sleeve hung out of the top of it, soaking up rain. 3 weeks. That was how old their daughter was. 3 weeks since Afra had given birth in a hospital where Salim had checked his phone the entire time and left before the nurses brought the baby back. She should have known then. Maybe a part of her did know and simply refused to believe a man could be that cold to something so small. Earlier that evening, the house had been full. Salim had thrown a dinner for the partners of his family's real estate firm. Crystal glasses, soft jazz, important men in expensive coats. Afra had served and smiled and stayed in the corners the way they liked her to. She had spent the afternoon cooking, the baby strapped to her chest the whole time because Della refused to hire help. For a girl who came from nothing and should be grateful for the work. And then, in front of all those guests, Salim had raised his glass and announced that he was cleaning house. He looked right at her when he said it. He said a man at his level needed a partner who understood the business, who could stand beside him at events like this without looking like the help. He said it with a smile, like it was charming. The room had laughed like it was a joke. It was not a joke. Afra had felt the heat climb her neck, felt every eye in the room slide over her and find her wanting, and still she had said nothing. She had only held her daughter a little tighter and waited, the way she had learned to wait. What none of those laughing guests knew was that the wine in their glasses, the roof over their heads that night, the very floor they stood on, had been quietly provided by the woman they were laughing at. His mother, Della, had been waiting years for this night. She had never accepted Afra. To her, Afra was a girl from nowhere, a girl who grew up above a closed-down laundromat, a girl with no name and no money who had somehow trapped her brilliant son. Della had whispered into Salim's ear for years, drop by drop, like water wearing down a stone. She found fault in everything Afra did. The food was too plain or too rich. The baby cried too much. Afra smiled too little, or worse, too much. Nothing was ever right, because the truth was that Afra's only real crime was existing in a place Della felt she did not belong. Tonight the stone had finally broken, and Della had been the water. And then there was Renee. Sharp, polished, ambitious Renee. A junior associate at the firm who had decided months ago that she deserved Salim and everything he stood to inherit. She had been patient too, in her own way. She had laughed at Della's jokes, brought Salim coffee exactly how he liked it, stayed late at the office when Afra was home alone with a newborn. She had studied the family the way a thief studies a house, learning the doors and the weak windows. She had decided that Afra was the only thing standing between her and a life of soft money and softer mornings. Tonight she stood behind Salim like she already owned the doorway. and the glass in her hand was a celebration she had earned through months of quiet work. "You have nothing," Salim said to Afra, his breath sharp with wine. "You came here with nothing. You'll leave with nothing. Don't come back." Afra said one thing only. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Be careful, Salim." Della laughed. Renee smirked. Salim rolled his eyes and shut the door, and the lock turned with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The rain came harder. Afra pulled the blanket tighter over her baby's head and started walking, because standing still in the cold was not an option when you held a newborn. Her shoes filled with water, her arms ached. The trash bag was too heavy to carry far, so she left it on a bench and took only what mattered, which was the child and the key around her neck. And still she did not cry, because somewhere underneath the pain, a very old and very patient part of her had already begun to wake up. She walked 3 blocks in the storm before she could think straight. Cars hissed past. A man under an awning watched her with tired pity, but did not move. The baby began to fuss, a thin sound against the rain, and Afra bent her whole body around her daughter to keep her warm, whispering the lullaby Mama Ruth used to hum over the washing machines. It was the only thing that had ever steadied her, and it steadied her now. At the corner, a car was idling. The window came down. It was Samuel, the family's longtime driver, a graying man who had carried Salim to school as a boy and had watched this family rot from the inside for 30 years. He had been parked there for an hour because he had heard Salim's plan that afternoon and could not bring himself to drive home and pretend he had not. He did not say a word at first. He simply opened the back door and held up an umbrella, and his eyes were wet in a way the rain could not explain. "Get in, Miss Afra," he said softly. "Please." She got in. As the car pulled away, she looked back once at the brownstone, at the tall buildings rising behind it into the storm, and she pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. None of those men in that house knew it yet. But the woman they had just thrown away owned the very ground their pride was standing on. Afra grew up poor above her grandmother, Mama Ruth's laundromat, where she learned kindness, sacrifice, and the belief that a roof is a promise. Before dying, Mama Ruth gave her a mysterious brass key and told her it would one day open an important door. Years later, carrying those lessons in her heart, Afra quietly began building something of her own before she ever met Salim. She met him when they were both young and both broke. He was charming then, full of dreams, talking about buildings he would build and a name he would make. He used to walk her home past the construction sites and point up at the cranes and say, "One day, Afra, one day all of this is going to know my name." She loved that version of him with her whole heart. She believed in him so completely that she did something she never told a single soul about. When his first deals were failing, when the money ran out and the family firm nearly folded before it began, it was Afra, quietly, who kept it alive. Money appeared at the right moments from sources Salim never questioned. He thought he was lucky. He thought he was gifted. He never once thought to ask who was holding the net beneath him every time he leaped. Because here is the truth nobody in that brownstone ever guessed. Afra was not a girl from nowhere. Afra was the quiet hand behind everything. After Mama Ruth died, the bank took the laundromat building. The whole block was sold off cheap to developers who wanted to flatten it. And something in Afra simply refused to let it go. She studied at night. She learned how property worked, how loans worked, how the people with money kept their names off the paper and their fortunes hidden in plain sight. And then, quietly, under a holding company with a plain and forgettable name, she began to buy. First, she bought back her grandmother's block, brick by brick, foreclosure by foreclosure. It took her 3 years just to reclaim the laundromat building, and the day the deed came through with her holding company's name on it, she sat on the floor of the empty shop and wept until she had nothing left. Then she dried her face and bought the building next door. Then the one after that. For 10 years, she expanded in total silence, never putting her own name on anything, never letting anyone see the size of what she was building. She let people believe she was just Salim's plain little wife. She let the world look right past her, because being underestimated, she had learned, was the cheapest power in the world and the most dangerous to ignore. She learned to read a room the way her grandmother read the weather. She learned that the men who shouted loudest about their fortunes usually owned the least, and the truly powerful never raised their voices at all. She learned to sign documents in conference rooms where the lawyers assumed she was someone's assistant, and to let them assume it. Every time someone underestimated her, she let it happen, and she filed it away. And she grew. There was a moment, early on, when she nearly told Salim everything. She had stood in their kitchen with the words on her tongue, ready to lay her whole secret at his feet, to say, "My love, you do not have to be afraid anymore, because I have built us a wall the world cannot knock down." But something had stopped her. She had watched the way his eyes lit up when he talked about owning things, the hunger in them, the way the dream of being a big man mattered to him more than the small, true things right in front of him. And a quiet voice inside her, her grandmother's voice, had whispered, "Not yet, child. A man should be loved for what he is, not for what you can give him. Let him show you who he is first." So she had swallowed the words, and she had waited, and she had watched. And over the years, slowly, Salim had shown her exactly who he was. The night of the trash bag was not a surprise. It was simply the last page of a book she had been reading for a very long time. And the cruelest, most beautiful secret of all? The family firm that Della was so proud of, the firm Salim bragged about at dinner parties, did not actually own most of the buildings it operated. It leased them from a quiet holding company, the same company that had been collecting rent from the Bennett family for years without a single one of them knowing whose pocket that money truly filled. Every time Salim signed a check to the landlord, he was paying the woman who slept beside him. Every time Della sneered that Afra had married up, she was living, quite literally, under Afra's roof. Now Afra sat in the back of Samuel's car at 1 in the morning, soaked to the bone, holding the brass key in one hand and her sleeping daughter in the other. The contrast was almost too sharp to bear. The gentle girl who had slept among 20 warm children on a winter night, and the silent woman who owned half a skyline, were the same person. And both of them had just been handed a trash bag and pushed into the rain by a man who could not survive a single season without her. Both of them were very, very tired. And both of them, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, were beginning to remember exactly who they were. "Where do I take you, Miss Afra?" Samuel asked. She thought of the grand homes she could buy, the penthouses, the suites. Then she thought of her grandmother's words about small things and big doors. "Somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere nobody will look." Samuel took her to a modest apartment in an ordinary building, a unit that, like so much else, quietly belonged to her under a name no one would ever connect to Afra Bennett. It had a bed, a small heater, and a window. For now, it was enough. Lying awake that first night, Afra let herself remember the marriage as it truly was, not the version she had told herself to survive it. She remembered the anniversary Salim forgot, and the way Della had laughed when Afra cooked the dinner anyway and ate it alone. She remembered being 8 months pregnant and asked to serve drinks at a party where Renee was the guest of honor, and how Salim had not even noticed she was on her feet for 6 hours. She remembered 1,000 small cuts, each one too small to bleed, that together had drained something out of her she had not even known she was losing. She had told herself it was love. She saw now that it had been service mistaken for love, by a woman so used to giving that she forgot she was allowed to be given to. The days that followed were the hardest of her life, not because of money, because of silence. The phone did not ring. No one came looking. It was as if she and her daughter had simply been erased from the world, folded up and thrown out with the trash bag her clothes had come in. She had built an empire that touched a quarter of the city, and she could not find one person who would simply sit with her in the dark. She told herself it did not matter. She had survived alone before. But there is a particular loneliness in being discarded by the very people you carried, and it has a weight that money cannot lift. Afra felt that weight settle onto her chest in the small hours, when the baby finally slept, and there was nothing left to do but feel. Across town, Salim wasted no time. Within a week, Renee had moved into the brownstone. She walked through Afra's old home, touching everything, rearranging everything, laughing in the rooms where Afra had once rocked her baby to sleep. She threw out Afra's things, gave away her books, painted over the small pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe, where Afra had once dreamed of measuring her daughter's height year by year. Della was thrilled. She told her friends that her son had finally corrected a mistake. She told them Afra had run off and abandoned the family, and the story spread, and people believed it because people always believe the loud voice over the quiet one. Salim and Renee began to spend. They redecorated, they threw parties. They moved money around with the easy confidence of people who believe the ground beneath them will never shift. Why wouldn't they? The firm's buildings were full. The rent came in. The lifestyle held. None of them ever asked the one question that mattered, the question Mama Ruth would have asked first. They never once asked, "Whose roof is this, really?" And Afra, alone in her quiet apartment, came closer to breaking than she had ever come in her life. The exhaustion was bone deep. A newborn does not care about your heartbreak. She wakes every 2 hours, hungry, crying, needing. Afra fed her in the dark and stared at the wall and felt something inside her go numb. There were nights she held the brass key and thought about the simplest escape of all. Sign everything away, dissolve the company, vanish to some far place where no one had ever heard the name Bennett, and let Salim keep his beautiful lie until it collapsed on top of him. She was so tired. That was the thing no one tells you about being strong for too long. Strength is not a feeling, it is a debt, and the body keeps the bill. Afra had carried Salim, carried the firm, carried her grandmother's whole block of dreams on her back for a decade, and now she was carrying a newborn through the wreckage of her marriage. And some mornings she could not remember why she kept standing up. One gray morning, she actually got as far as the paperwork. She sat at the small table with a pen in her hand and the documents in front of her, ready to give it all up just to make the ache stop. Her daughter slept in a basket beside her, and as Afra looked down at that tiny, peaceful face, she heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if Mama Ruth were standing in the room. A roof is a promise, child. Don't you break a promise to the people under it. Afra put down the pen. She looked at the brass key in her palm, and for the first time in all these years, she finally understood which door it opened. Not a metaphor, a real door. The old steel door to the deed vault beneath the laundromat building, where the original papers of everything she had built were locked away. The legal heart of the entire empire. Her grandmother had given her the key to it years before Afra ever built a thing, as if the old woman had somehow known. That same week, Samuel came to see her. He had kept driving for the family because, as he put it, a man hears more when they forget he is in the room. And what he had heard turned Afra's grief into something colder and steadier. "They're having a party," Samuel said quietly. "A big one. A charity gala up on that rooftop venue downtown, all the investors, all the press. Mr. Salim is going to announce his engagement to that woman. He's calling it the start of a new era for the family name." Afra was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time in weeks, something in her face changed. Not anger. Something calmer than anger and far more dangerous. "What rooftop venue?" she asked, though she already knew. She owned it. That night, after Samuel had gone, Afra stood at her small window and looked out at the city she had quietly built a piece of, brick by silent brick. The lights stretched to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Salim was rehearsing a speech about a legacy that did not belong to him. Somewhere, Della was choosing a gown. Somewhere, Renee was admiring herself in a mirror that, like everything else, was not truly hers. Afra looked down at the brass key in her hand. The numbness was gone. In its place was something quiet and certain. The feeling Mama Ruth must have had on that cold winter night with 20 sleeping children, and nothing but the heat of the machines. She was not going to destroy them. She was simply going to stop lying for them. She was going to walk into the one room where they felt most powerful, and she was going to set the truth down gently on the table. And then she was going to let the truth do what truth always does. She kissed her sleeping daughter and whispered the only promise that had ever mattered in her family. "I've got you," she said. "I've got the roof. Always." The gala was everything Salim had dreamed of. The rooftop glittered above the city, strung with lights, crowded with the most important names in the business. Cameras flashed. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays. Della wore a gown that cost more than most people made in a season and accepted congratulations like a queen. Renee stood at Salim's side in white, glowing, certain that tonight was her coronation. Below them, the city Afra had helped to hold up went about its quiet business. Somewhere down there, a family slept warm in an apartment that, unknown to them, would never raise their rent past what they could pay, because the landlord had built a rule into every lease that no one was ever to be put out into the cold. None of the people on that rooftop knew rules like that existed. They thought property was only a way to take. They had never once been taught, as Afra had, that property could be a way to keep a promise. Salim tapped his glass, and the room went quiet. He gave a speech about legacy, about building something that lasts, about the strong men who shape a city's skyline. He spoke of his family firm as though he had carried it on his own back. He thanked his mother. He thanked his investors. He did not thank the wife who had kept the firm alive in its first dark years, because he had convinced himself, the way weak men do, that he had never needed her at all. And then he announced his engagement, and the rooftop erupted in applause, and the cameras drank it all in. That was the moment the elevator opened. Afra stepped out, and the applause did not stop all at once. It died slowly, person by person, as heads turned and conversations faltered. She was not dressed to outshine anyone. She wore a simple, dark coat and a calm that filled the whole rooftop like cold air. She had left her daughter safe below with a woman she trusted. She walked through the crowd, and the crowd parted, not knowing why, only feeling that something enormous was about to happen. "What is she doing here?" Della hissed. "Throw her out! Someone throw her out!" But no one moved, because the security at the door worked for the building, and the building, though none of them knew it, worked for Afra. She stopped in front of Salim. She did not raise her voice. She reached into her coat and drew out a single folded document, and she held it out to him the way you would hand a man a mirror. "You should read this before you toast your new era," she said. Salim snatched it, half laughing, ready to make a joke for the cameras. The laugh died on his face as he read. It was the master lease, the agreement that bound his family's entire firm, every office, every building they operated, to a holding company as their landlord. And there, on the signature line, where an owner's name would be, was a name his lawyers had seen 100 times and never once questioned. Hers. He read it again. His eyes moved across the page the way a man's eyes move when his mind refuses to accept what they are showing him. The cameras kept flashing. The investors leaned in. Somewhere, a glass was set down on a table too hard. "This is a fake," he said, but his voice had no floor under it. "The venue you're standing on is mine," Afra said, still calm, still quiet, letting each word land like a stone into still water. "The building your office sits in is mine. The home your mother is so proud of is leased from me. And the brownstone you threw me out of? You don't own it, Salim. You never did. You've been paying rent to me for years and calling it your fortune." She did not stop there. She turned, slowly, so the whole rooftop could hear her, and she named them. The tower on Fifth that the firm bragged about in its brochures, the shopping road downtown, the block of apartments Della called the family's crown. One by one, Afra laid them on the table, and one by one, the guests understood that the empire they had come to celebrate was a borrowed coat, and the woman in the plain dark coat had owned it all along. A sound moved through the crowd, but it was not gasping. It was worse. It was the slow, sick understanding spreading across the faces of the investors. Men who had put their money behind the Bennett name, now realizing in real time that the name owned almost nothing it claimed. One by one they turned to look at Afra, and then at each other, and the math of the whole evening rearranged itself in front of them. Renee's champagne glass lowered slowly until it hung forgotten at her side. Della reached out and gripped the rooftop railing as though the floor had tilted, and Salim stood frozen with the lease shaking in his hand, finally, fully understanding the thing he had done. He had not thrown out a poor, helpless woman. He had evicted his own landlord. He had cast into the rain the single hand that held up his entire world. The fortune in question was almost too large to say out loud. Let it be enough to know this. The rent the Bennett family had unknowingly paid Afra in a single year was more than enough for her to buy their whole firm twice over. And still, she had only ever taken what they owed, and never a dollar more. That was the part that truly broke them. Not that she was rich, that she had been merciful for years, and they had mistaken her mercy for weakness. Because that is the thing the cruel never understand about the kind. They look at gentleness and they see something soft, something that can be pushed, something that exists to be used. They never once consider that gentleness might be a choice made by someone who could crush them and simply prefers not to. For 10 years, Afra had held the power to ruin the Bennett family on any given morning, and every single morning she had chosen not to. She had let Della insult her. She had let Salim take the credit. She had let Renee circle closer and closer, all because she still loved the dream of a family more than she loved being right. They had spent years standing on a trap door, never knowing it was there, never knowing whose hand rested on the lever. And the only reason it had never opened was that the woman they despised had kept choosing, day after day, to keep them safe. Until the night they handed her a trash bag in the rain, and finally, gently, she took her hand off the lever. Afra turned to go. Then she paused and looked back at Salim one last time, and her voice, when it came, was almost soft. "You told me I'd never survive without you," she said. "Salim, you were never the roof. You were only ever standing under mine." And she walked to the elevator, and the doors closed on the most powerful man in the room, now standing in the ruins of a night he had built for himself. Behind those closing doors, the rooftop did not stay quiet for long. The investors did not wait for the party to end. They surrounded Salim before Afra's elevator had even reached the ground, demanding answers he did not have, asking about leases and titles and guarantees, and every answer he gave only deepened the hole. Della tried to take control the way she always had, with a sharp voice and a sharper chin, but for the first time in her life, her voice did not work. People simply talked over her, around her, past her, as though she had become what she had always accused Afra of being, someone who did not matter. Renee had already drifted toward the edge of the crowd, her white dress catching the light, her eyes doing the cold arithmetic of a woman recalculating her future. By the time the caterers began clearing the tables, the engagement no one had questioned an hour before had quietly ceased to exist. What happened next did not happen with shouting. It happened the way truly serious things happen in the world of money, quietly, on paper, and all at once. Afra did not need revenge. She only needed to stop carrying people who had never once thanked her for the weight. So she simply let go. She did nothing cruel. She did nothing at all, in fact, except decline to keep saving them. The leases came due. For years, the family firm had paid rents that were generous, almost gentle, because the landlord had quietly cared about the man she once loved. Now those rents reset to what the market truly demanded, and the firm discovered, all at once, that it had never been profitable on its own. It had been floating on Afra's kindness like a boat that never knew it was being carried by the tide. The investors moved fast. Money has no loyalty to a humiliated name. Once they understood that the Bennett firm owned almost none of the assets it had borrowed against, they pulled out and they pulled out together, and the firm came apart in a matter of weeks. It happened the way a sandcastle goes when the tide finally reaches it. First the edges, then the walls, then, all at once, the whole proud shape of it dissolving back into ordinary ground. The phones at the firm stopped ringing with opportunities and started ringing with demands. The lawyers Salim had trusted began to send their bills, and then to send their regrets. The men who had toasted him on the rooftop crossed the street now when they saw him coming, the way people do when failure might be catching. Renee was the first to leave. She had never wanted Salim. She had wanted the empire. And the moment she understood that he had no empire, that he had in fact been living inside someone else's, she packed her white dresses and walked out without a word. The cruelty she had aimed at Afra for months came home to Salim in a single afternoon. Della's grand home, the one she had bragged about, the one she had used to look down on the girl from above the laundromat, turned out to be leased from the very woman she had despised. When she could no longer pay, she had to leave it. For the first time in her life, Della understood what it felt like to stand on the wrong side of a closing door, and the smile she had worn that midnight on the porch was gone for good. As for Salim, he came to Afra at last, not for love, for rescue. He stood at the door of her quiet apartment, thinner, grayer, humbled, and he asked her to save him the way she had always quietly saved him before. He talked about their daughter. He talked about second chances. He talked about everything except the rain and the trash bag, and the words he had said with a glass in his hand. He told her he understood now. He told her he had been a fool, that his mother had poisoned him, that Renee had used him, that none of it had been truly his fault. And there it was, the thing that finally let Afra close the door without a single regret. Even now, at the bottom of everything, Salim could not say the two simple words she would once have crossed an ocean to hear. He could not say, "I'm sorry." He could only explain why nothing had ever been his doing. A man who will not own his worst night will never deserve his best one. Afra listened to all of it. She let him finish, because her grandmother had raised her to let even cruel men finish. Then she gave him exactly what he had given her. She looked at him with something that was almost pity, and she said gently, "Be careful going down the stairs, Salim. It's a long way." And she closed the door, and the lock turned with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She did not slam it. She did not gloat. A woman who truly holds power has no need to perform it. She simply let the door close and went back inside to her daughter, and that was the end of Salim Bennett's reign over a kingdom that had never been his. And Samuel, the driver, the one man who had held up an umbrella in the rain when everyone else held up a glass. Afra did not forget him. She gave him the keys to the rebuilt laundromat block and made him its caretaker, with a home above it and a salary that let him rest his old bones at last. "A roof is a promise," she told him, and he understood exactly what she meant, because he had been keeping his own quiet promise to her grandmother's memory for 30 years. A year later, the corner that money had forgotten was alive again. Afra had not built towers of glass with her grandmother's old block. She had built something Mama Ruth would have recognized. The laundromat hummed once more on the ground floor, free for anyone who could not pay. Above it were small, clean homes for families who had nowhere else to go. There was a room where children gathered after school, and a teacher who was paid well to be there, and a cash box that was always nearly empty for all the right reasons. The rent from a skyline now flowed quietly back into a single, forgotten block, feeding the neighborhood that had once fed a little girl with nothing. The people who had thrown Afra away had spent her fortune on champagne and pride. The people who had raised her would spend it on warmth and books and second chances. On the wall of the community room, in a simple frame, hung an old brass key with no label. Children asked about it sometimes. Afra always told them the same thing. "It opens a door," she would say, smiling, "but only the right one. Never open it for anything small." Her daughter grew strong and laughing and loved, surrounded by people, never once knowing the range she had been born into, only the roof her mother had built over her for good. Sometimes, in the evening, Afra would sit on the steps of the laundromat with the child on her knee, and watch the block fill with light, window by window, as families came home. She would think about the man who had told her she would never survive without him, and she would feel, to her own surprise, no anger at all. Only a quiet kind of peace, the peace of a woman who had been tested by cold and proven to herself, once and for all, that she was made of the same warm, stubborn stuff as her grandmother. Salim had taken everything he could carry and found that none of it was his. Afra had been left with nothing but a baby and a key, and had turned it into a home for 100 people. That, she understood now, was the only fortune that had ever mattered. And the cornerstone of the old building, the one Afra had glanced at on the worst night of her life, was finally repainted. Where a developer's forgotten name had faded, a new name was carved deep into the stone, in letters meant to last 100 years. Not Bennett, the name her grandmother gave her. The name they had all looked past. The name that had quietly owned everything all along. In the end, it wasn't about money or revenge. It was about respect. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They may be the ones holding up your entire world.